radio program every Friday from 10 to 11. This is a call-in show, and I hope you'll feel like you can participate with us. Call in and share with me your thoughts, your ideas. They're as valuable as mine, and I want to hear from you if you feel like you'd like to participate. Give us a call here, 801-224-1414, and share your thoughts on this. In past shows, we've discussed the Constitution, and we've discussed who wrote it. We're going to discuss some more of that again today. We've quoted several of our founding fathers. One of my favorite quotes, which I've used so many times, I just about consider it scripture, is one from John Adams, because I believe it is so true. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. This man, one of the founding fathers, was coming up with a new method of government called self-government. This was something new back in those days. And his observation, people have to be willing to govern themselves with morality and religion. They have to have that as a people, or this Constitution, which they were creating, would be destroyed. As he says, it'll destroy it. David O. McKay, another religious leader of the LDS Church, made the observation, and let me give his background first before he made this observation. He was made an apostle, 1906. A member of the First Presidency, 1934, and then he became the prophet of the LDS Church, 1951. 1952, he made this statement: during the first half of the 20th century, we have traveled far into the soul-destroying land of socialism. This was his observation. To him, this was not just an economic or a political philosophy with some minor consequences that you and I can vote on, and what's the diff? This man, who had been a member of the First Presidency and in the highest councils of the church for 44 of those 50 years, says we've traveled far into the soul-destroying land of socialism. One of the evidences, which I've talked about in the past also, is that in 1900, less than 1% of the federal budget had gone outside the original intent of our founding fathers. But by 1940, 40 years later, 60% of our budget was now being spent on socialism. That's why I believe President McKay made his observation: during the first half of the 20th century, we have traveled far into the soul-destroying land of socialism. Again, soul-destroying. Those are his words. And it's not just an economic decision, it's a soul-destroying decision if we've gone in the wrong direction. Well, last week we got to talking about licensing laws. And if you want to participate in this program, if you've had some thoughts since last week, give us a call here, 801-224-1414. This is Hans Anderson. And we're talking about the fact that sometimes people think that all the evil that's done happens in Washington, D.C., and that our city councils, our mayors, our county commissioners, our state legislators, our governors, they're all benevolent people filled with wisdom and good judgment. And I've made the observation that that's not true. Our local people, they can make just as many mistakes as the federal people. It's just they're not in a position to do as much damage with their poor judgment, with their lack of understanding. Last week I talked about a friend of mine who got his barber license, and a friend of his who had cut hair for over 30 years, possibly as many as 100,000 people whose hair he had cut who got caught because he didn't have a barber license. And how to do his restitution, his penance, whatever you want to call it, the state required him to go to school for 1,000 hours so that he could clean up his act, so to speak, after doing damage to about 100,000 people over 30 years. And I also made the observation, humorously again, that my mother used to cut my hair and my 10 brothers and sisters' hair. And if there was any evidence that someone needed to go to barber school, it was evident from the 11 of us that we were walking billboards that maybe somebody needed to go to barber school, but probably not the guy who'd been cutting hair for 30 years. Well, I next went on to point out that there's a little humor in that, but what about the doctor? What about the engineer? What about the architect? What about the fellow who, you've heard the story my mother used to tell us. Yes, a bad haircut may be a bad haircut, but it'll be okay in another 3 or 4 days. Hardly anybody will notice the damage I've done to you. What about the doctor, though, and these other professionals? Well, as I pointed out last week, which profession is sued the most? Which profession has the greatest liability insurance they have to pay? And at the same time, which profession is the most highly educated? Which profession has the most experience of all the professions out there? Doctors. Before they can hold themselves out to the public, they go through all kinds of education. They go through training in hospitals. And yet this is the group which, as a public, we pick on the most. We go after them. We sue them. And I talked about the fact, well, maybe what we need to do is eliminate about 90% of the doctors and just keep the top 10%. And I want you to know that under new Obamacare laws, more people are going to be leaving the medical profession. They're going to start retiring early. We won't have to be saying, let's eliminate some. They'll be eliminating themselves. I was in the emergency room here a few months ago. I cut myself with a chainsaw, and I'm not going to explain how because that's enough stupid observations of myself. How on earth can a man cut his arm with a chainsaw? Well, I managed to do it. Well, while this doctor was there working on me, I talked to him about his education, what he'd been through, and why he was in the emergency room. And he said, well, I like to work with people. I like to help them. And I got to talking to him about insurance and his work. He said, less than half the people I work on pay me. Less than half. And I started talking to him about lawyers and lawsuits and so forth. But how would you like to go to work every day and realize that you're not going to get paid half the days that you work? That man does it. He told me he liked working with people. He liked helping people. He said he also liked to get paid. But I know other doctors like that. I told you some of the stories in the past. These are good men. And I'm not beating up on them because I think so many of the ones I know, their hearts are right and they mean well. The observation I would make, though, is we should not license people any more than the barber and say by some stretch of the imagination we've solved the problem of competence versus incompetence out there in the field. It just is not going to happen. Even if you had a self-policing force in any area, and I like to go to the doctor because that's the one that terrifies people the most. What? You'd let someone who hasn't been licensed by the state go out and treat people? If you had a self-policing of the medical profession, how long do you think the doctor who watches himself would say, man, I should have made that prescription a little weaker or a little stronger? Or I wish I'd cut this way instead of that way when I was doing that surgery. I wish I had done this or done that. If you eliminated every doctor who went through that thought process while he's trying to help us and serve us, you wouldn't have any doctors left out there. There wouldn't be a one. Probably most would be gone within a week because they could identify in their own experience some knowledge that they gained, some experience they've had, some error that they made. So my solution to this is let those doctors who have the most education and the most experience band together, form their own group that says these are our credentials, and might I add, and we are not perfect, but we have had this experience, we have had this training, and we hope you'll come to us. But don't use a license law. That skewers things. It throws reality all out of kilter. Let the man who's going to pay the bill make the observation and the evaluation. Let him determine who he's going to give his money to. You don't want to be guilty of unrighteous dominion by saying, somebody might make a mistake. There are plenty of laws out there dealing with someone who lies, someone who misrepresents his credentials or his professional ability. And even though we have these laws which supposedly eliminate that, again, we sue the best right under the table. Why? Well, maybe we think they've made a mistake. Maybe they've made a mistake, but they are not perfect either. There's not a one who could not use more experience, more knowledge. And even if he gets it, which of us does not start thinking, my memory's not as good as it used to be, or I should have remembered that, I forgot that. Who can say that they have arrived and their fellow man has not arrived? Let the man who pays the bill make those decisions. From a church perspective, not just from a logical perspective, my father used to point out that it's the nature and disposition of almost all men. As soon as they get a little authority, as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. And he felt, this is what he taught me, the one place where individuals, talking about you and I, where we can exercise dominion over one another is in the area of government. That's where we go in the voting booth and we decide what laws we're going to favor. And if we believe in exercise unrighteous dominion on one another, as the scripture goes on, D&C 121, which talks about many are called and few are chosen, if the few who were chosen refers to the priesthood holders who have not overcome their disposition to exercise unrighteous dominion, then in the eternities we lose our priesthood. We cannot be trusted with God's power because we will use it unrighteously. My father felt so strongly about these licensing and these regulatory laws going against God's laws. My mother used to tell me at times he'd come home and cry himself to sleep as he thought about the laws that they were passing. Just before he started his work as a legislator, spent 4 years up there before he had his district gerrymandered out from under him by the powers that be, the Republican Party. He told my grandmother he was going to go around and give every legislator a copy of his book, Many Are Called But Few Are Chosen, and try and educate them. And he was quite enthused about his options of voting on laws and encouraging others to vote correctly. He said he was going to pick his battles, and then he'd approach other legislators explaining the error of whichever legislation he had chosen to attack, and then he'd persuade them to vote for the proper role of government on this particular law. And he'd give them a copy of his book for backup. And at first he was really gratified with how this went. I remember talking with him about it, as he said people understood, and they would vote against these laws that he was saying, these are wrong, these should not be voted for. His disappointment followed, though, because a few weeks later the same slightly modified legislation would show up again, and it would pass overwhelmingly against his vote. And he didn't use this. I'm a little more judgmental, I suppose, but the vast majority of our legislators then, and I suppose still now, are something like porcelain eggs. Have you ever had chickens? I raised chickens when I was a boy. And to get the chickens to lay eggs, you'd take porcelain eggs and you'd set them down in the nest. And the chicken would come along and say, oh, there's an egg in there. I guess I can go in there and lay an egg. And so you put these porcelain eggs to help identify in the nest to help identify where to go lay the additional eggs. Well, if Daddy was sitting on these legislators, like the mother hen sits on a porcelain egg, they could warm it up. They could warm up that porcelain egg, and they could understand and they could believe in the proper role of government. But my dad couldn't sit on them all the time. And as soon as he left to go visit other legislators and try and teach them correct principles, that egg that he had tried to help would lose its life. It would slowly grow cold again. It didn't stay warm. It didn't hold within it the conversion that he had put them through on the proper role of government. His persuasive reasoning would enter their minds, and unfortunately, that persuasive reasoning could easily be turned by counter-persuasive reasoning of other legislators who would then come around and say, man is a fool. Man needs this law to protect him from himself. Man does not have judgment. Man shouldn't be given his agency in this area. And so my father, for the 4 years, he continued to struggle and reason and pray, but time and again, he lost. I think, I've mentioned this before. He was given this award, Mr. No, at the governor's ball for having voted against more legislation than any legislator who had ever been up there. He also voted against the law we talked about licensing poodle clippers here in Utah. Well, in my little corner of the world, which is identical to other areas of the country, state legislatures make mistakes. Our city councils make mistakes. Our cities, our county people, they're not satisfied to just protect us with a good police force, a good police department, and see they have the best equipment and they're the best trained police. They like to get involved in other areas, just like our state legislature has, passing laws they shouldn't. One of those is their involvement in what is known as CDBG funds, Community Development Block Grant funds, where the federal government comes in and takes tax dollars, that's the free tax dollars from the federal government, and acting like a benevolent dictator, our city officials then pass it out to some poor person. They're somewhat like a misguided bishop with a gun. They take from the haves and they give to the have-nots. And any group, and I've been to some of these meetings, any group doing good can show up at the city council meeting and present their case for getting some of these ill-gotten funds that the man with a gun, the federal government, has taken. And this is not money that a deacon went out with a blue envelope and collected from his neighbors. This is money collected to the point of a gun, which if you do not contribute to the federal system, or the state or the county federal system, force is used, whatever force is necessary to collect the money. Most of us don't have to be forced. We know what happens. It's kind of like the old Bill Cosby story. We never saw the belt that Dad used to threaten to whip the daylights out of him with, but we knew what the belt was. We didn't have to see it. So most of us, we don't break laws. We just go ahead and pay even if we don't agree. And I'm never going to say go break the law. Another area where our city goes off and wastes our energy, monies from our energies, are called redevelopment projects. And for years, Orem and Provo have competed with each other, and they have bribed dozens and dozens of businesses with tens of millions of taxpayers' dollars. That's your money. That's my money. These men, they tinker with the free enterprise system. Right now, Orem is on the hook for $39 million for Utopia. $39 million. We're on the hook for it. Why? Well, a bunch of do-gooders on the Orem City Council say they want to improve internet and phone service, and they think that bunch can do a better job than private enterprise. So they've signed on for $39 million worth of your money and my money to help provide better internet and phone service to the city. That sounds great, except once again, Orem has decided free enterprise was too slow. We're going to help it. So they were going to help. And that sounds great until you ask yourself, well, why wouldn't free enterprise do that? Why wouldn't they put up the $39 million? Because it was wasteful. And once again, a huge wasteful boondoggle is hanging over our heads, which you and I are going to pay for. Our city spent several million taxpayers' dollars building a parking lot for a business that free enterprise wouldn't pay for. $5.5 million. That's another example here in Orem. Our county commissioners and the Provo City Council have voted to spend millions more for a convention center in Provo. They're bonding for it. Why are they doing it? Well, free enterprise wouldn't do it. Do-gooders who don't believe in the proper role of government keep getting elected by us. They love to license. They love to redistribute tax dollars. They spend millions each year subsidizing a transportation system. Free enterprise wouldn't do that. They'd say it's got to carry its own water. Competing for something for nothing is something businesses are quick to grab for if they can get people elected, which will offer it to them. And of course, they'll tell you what a benevolent government it is which picks them to become the beneficiary of these millions and millions of dollars in benefits. You know, I think about that and I think, why is it that politicians don't understand that if private enterprise isn't willing to put up their money for these transportation projects, these parking lots, these convention centers, these internet and phone services, why is it that the politician doesn't understand that if private enterprise does not see that this is going to pay for itself, that it's not a worthwhile project, because they don't think it's worth the risk? What makes the politician think he can make a success of this same endeavor with taxpayers' money? These people, and we elect them, so I'm throwing no more rocks at them than I am at us. They're like benevolent dictators. And my encouragement to them is leave private enterprise alone. Don't get involved in projects which private enterprise says that won't work. It's not worth putting private money into it. Don't pretend you're smarter than private enterprise, city council, governor, state legislators, the county commission. They're all involved in this stuff. Leave things alone. Let private enterprise go decide where their money ought to be spent. Don't take it on yourself to try to outrun it. I was back in Nauvoo a few years back. I've been there maybe a dozen times over my lifetime, going back, seeing different things. And did you know that Nauvoo, Joseph Smith had voted to repeal all the city's licensing laws when he was the mayor? They had them, and then he changed his mind, said, we shouldn't be doing that. He got the city council to repeal the city licensing laws. Willing to follow Joseph Smith's counsel, my father offered a bill he titled No Punishment Without Proof of Guilt. This is when he was in the state legislature, which would have repealed most of the licensing laws in Utah. It left the driving one alone. That's federal. Anyway, a lot of our driving's on federal roads. But a budget office employee who reviewed it told Daddy it would repeal about 85% of the laws on Utah's books. Another legislator who was looking over what Dad was proposing estimated that it would repeal about 90% of Utah's laws. And I throw this out here, again throwing rocks at the city council, the county commission, and state legislature here again, to point out that if you agree with what my father perceived as the proper role of government, the vast majority of the legislation, like the poodle clipping law, is where our legislators, our city councils, our county commissioners spend almost all their time. And it's not right. It's wrong. The laws we favor in this life may not pass. The ones we oppose may pass without our support, like my father's bill. But they may determine eternally the companions we'll have in the next life, as we attempt to say, this is proper and this is improper use of force on our fellow man. Is there any evidence that this is a true observation? You know, we don't know much about the pre-existence and how we exercised our agency there. We do know Christ, and Satan presented us with Plan A and Plan B. And with Plan A, Christ said we would have our agency and we would make mistakes. And Christ said he would pay for our sins, our mistakes, if we repented. Plan B, Satan's plan, was that we would have no agency. But no one would have to suffer for their mistakes. All would be saved. And whether or not we came to earth for this second test was determined by our attitude towards agency in those councils. Plan A or Plan B. I'm pleased to announce that every one of us that are here today, except those little devils we can't see, we all voted for Plan A. The only reason we're here today with a body, exercising our agency and rubbing shoulders with one another, voting for things that we're given as a choice where we're going to exercise our agency, they're all being acted upon by people who voted for Plan A. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but it appears to me that part of Plan A is that you and I still choose Plan B. We still can. You think you passed the one test, that's enough. Well, that's not enough. There is a devil. He's still around, and he still is promoting Plan B. Whether it's in our city councils, our county commissions, people who do not understand agency and do not understand the proper role of government are voting to take away man's agency. How serious that's going to be, I don't know. But I'm concerned about it. You know, years ago as a bishop, I had a man come into my office, and he tried to convince me that I should turn my loyalty to Satan. This is a true story. He explained to me that Satan is who really loved me because he guaranteed me a place in the celestial kingdom. Christ wouldn't do that for me. Christ was willing to stand by and let me fail. Let me make the wrong choices. Let me go to hell. Christ was willing to do that. Satan is who I failed to follow in the pre-existence. But the option I have here is I can repent. Join Satan and be guaranteed exaltation in his kingdom. Is that what I want? Well, that's not going to happen, not if you read the Scriptures. No one can tell me the two plans are not still being presented to us here on earth. The same arguments are still being presented to us to take away our agency or to give it to us. There are areas where God says, if you do this or that, you will be punished. We have the Ten Commandments and the penalties which God passed out for us if we violate certain things. But agency in other areas, God left to us to choose. Once again, here on this earth, we're given the choice of following Christ or Satan. But this time, while we have our strengths and our weaknesses inside our spirits, we can't remember the counsel. We can't remember the choice. We can't remember the fight. We can't remember the discussions. If you believe that, and I do, then it should not sound too strange to hear the possibility that maybe where we end up in the next life again, and I'm repeating myself with this, depends on our belief regarding the agency of others and our fellow man. All right, we're halfway through, and I've finished beating up on the state legislators, the city council. If you want to participate and you want to beat up on them or you want to defend them, give us a call here, 801-224-1414. I'm expressing my opinion. This is Hans Anderson, and I'm willing to let you have yours. I wanted to get back now into our Constitution, get back to the discussion of our federal government, unless one of you want to call and participate on this city council in the proper role of government. Do you think we ought to have laws which compel people to get a license? Where do you think it breaks down? Is it right? Or should we eliminate 90% of the laws out there where our city councils and our county commissions and our state legislators and our federal people seem to violate my sense of right and wrong and my sense of what the proper role of government is on a daily basis? They spend very little time dealing with where they ought to be spending their time. Well, getting back to our federal discussion here and our Constitution, and this is something I'm fortunate. I grew up with a father who knew the Constitution. He taught me about it. And so I would talk to other people about it. I'd talk to people about it in classes. I remember one time sitting in class, and there was an economics professor up at BYU, and he knew my name. I was named after my father, and so I was picked out of the 60 or 70 students sitting out there immediately because he was one of the people who didn't agree with my father. My father taught economics at Arizona State, but people have their freedom to exercise their agency. But this man made the observation to the other students that Mr. Anderson back there, referring to me, was one of those who thought that our government and our nation were great in spite of and not because of public education. And, of course, I was quick to agree with him. Of course, he hadn't read Brigham Young or John Taylor or Lorenzo Snow, others who talked about this issue. But on this Constitution, you and I were continually urging our fellow Americans, our friends, our fellow church members to read the Constitution. We're doing it all the time. And yet we learn, much to our chagrin, that even if they read it, they don't see what you and I see in it. And you and I can't communicate with them very well about what they're supposed to see, because what it contains is so unrelated to what our government does today compared to 200 years ago or even 100 years ago. They don't see it. All right, we have a caller. Good morning, caller.
Hello, my name is May Roberts, and I read about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence every day. Do you know that when they were trying to pass that, nobody could agree until Benjamin Franklin said, "Pray about it. Pray about it." It was passed.
Yeah, they fought for weeks. I remember reading that too.
They fought just terrible. And I got a book on the Constitution. And these men were thinking about people instead of trying to get more money.
Yeah. I've always thought, I read that 2 years ago, and I remember thinking, isn't that something that God would stand by and let those good men discuss and fight and argue over the Constitution, and they did it for weeks, but they couldn't get step one until someone said, why don't we ask God to help us?
That was Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin. A lot of people say, well, that guy wasn't any good. He made mistakes. He wasn't moral, on and on and on. And yet that was the man who, coming out of that, what most people would say isn't a good man, who said, we are dependent on God. Yeah, that's a beautiful story. I appreciate you bringing that up, because that is the only answer after it's all done.
In section 98, 101, and 109 talks about the Constitution.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I like to listen to you. You're smart.
Well, to use some of my piece of humor, you're one of the smartest people I know. You agree with me. We just need to get more to agree with us.
That's right.
We'll solve a lot of our nation's problems.
Yes, that's right. Most of them run for office so they get money.
Yeah.
I had somebody send me a flyer asking for $250. I ripped it up. He gave me another one. And finally he called me and said, "Mister, you're not getting the cent." And when you try to run for something just to get money, I says, I wouldn't run for you.
Yeah.
He did run, but he didn't win.
Yeah.
But keep up the good work you're doing. I like to listen to you.
Hey, well, thank you. I appreciate your call this morning.
God bless you.
Now, what city are you from?
My home state is Wausau, Wisconsin.
You're from Wisconsin, and where do you live now?
I'm here in Belleville.
Well, good for you. Well, I appreciate your call. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Well, I appreciate that caller. Any else wants to call in and join in, chime in, insult, attack me? You're welcome to do that too. This is a call-in show, and I hope you'll participate. Go ahead and join us here. Well, going on with this Constitution, you and I talked to people about read the Constitution. You know, I've literally passed out hundreds and hundreds of copies of the Constitution to people. And I like the words of William Gladstone. He was a British Prime Minister back in the, 1880s. Anyway, his observation, the American Constitution is, so far as I can see, the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. William Gladstone. You know, I see that and I say, hey, that man sees what I see. He feels what I feel. The most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. That's my way of saying, hey, or maybe his way of saying, God must have been involved in this. This is the most wonderful thing that ever happened, this American Constitution. And I feel that way. Others feel that way. Probably you people that are listening feel that way. Unfortunately, others, when they hear our words of excitement about it, read something like Gladstone or some of the prophets, they don't have that same excitement. You and I, we have arrived at a sense of appreciation for our Constitution by years of study, by evaluating it, by comparing good versus evil and what it was intended by our founding fathers. Most around us are missing the whole show, though. We can ask them to read the Constitution, and it's just another little thin paperback. They don't see what you and I see because you've studied it. I've studied it. We're like maybe two people sitting in a show house, and they're watching this big panoramic program in 3D going in front of us. And you're sitting next to your friend. He's sitting there next to you. And you say to your friend, did you see that? I can't believe it. How did he get away with that? Or isn't that neat? And your friend sitting next to you says, what? Did I see what? What are you talking about? Because he's not prepared for it yet. He hasn't done the study. You might compare yourself, if you love the Constitution, to the doctor who sees someone and he sees advanced stages of cancer, which can kill someone if it's not treated immediately. Your friend, however, looking at it, and this could be me, compared to a doctor, I would see a little red spot. And I wouldn't feel much concern. I wouldn't be worried about where this was leading that person if he didn't do something about it. You know, I get discouraged at times. I suppose you do too. I've been reading a book, and it's made me think what those men who tried to put our Constitution together were thinking, what environment they had to deal with. I've been reading out of my father's library. I've got 4 books on the works of Madison, James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution. And it's been interesting to read. This has books of letters he wrote to friends, starting earlier in the 1770s. Anyway, this is really neat. Did you know that if you go back to 1786, that James Madison had actually attempted to put together a constitutional convention in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland? It was put together to deal with commerce problems between the states. You know how many states showed up for that, what was supposed to have been the first constitutional convention? 5. 5 states showed up. So these representatives from these 5 different states, they're in Annapolis. They waited around for a week or two, discussed things, but before they could conduct any business, which the Articles of Confederation, which was what they were operating under, said they had to have at least 7 there to conduct business. They only had 5. So they went back home. And they again went to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation and said, hey, only 5 showed up. We need to have another convention. We need to do it again. So that's when they started organizing the one for 1787. April 22nd, going through these letters, I came across one where Madison had written, April 22nd, 1787, he'd written this letter to Edmund Pendleton. Madison said, as he was preparing for this convention, and he was from Virginia, he said, the nearer the crisis approaches, the more I tremble for the issue. That's page 317 out of Madison's works. Here they were getting ready to work on our Constitution. And as he contemplates it, he says, I tremble for the issue. They feared that their fellow Americans and others that were going to be coming to this convention would not see the necessity and the value of a constitution. He was afraid of it. He says he trembled for what might happen. And when you read of their fears, this has been very interesting to me to read through these letters, and you see the obstacles which were looming ahead of them that he was trying to prepare for. You can see why, when it was finished, these men did feel and said they felt divine providence had helped them. You and I can say only God can save this nation and get us back to our Constitution and save our nation. We can say that. We believe it. We know it. 200 years ago, these men were saying only God can get us to accept this Constitution and become a nation, become a republic. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about some of these challenges, and I won't be able to get through all these today, but I want to talk about some of these challenges these men were dealing with, getting ready to present to this Constitutional Convention. One of them, one of my favorites I like to talk about, was paper money. Madison, he hated it. He wrote about it, reading through these letters, about 50 pages worth. He just hated it. He talked about it all the time. And he wrote about Virginia and Massachusetts. They were getting ready to go on paper money. This is 1786. He wrote about the slavery question. He wrote about the fight between the big states and the small states. He used to write letters to these other people that were coming to the convention, where he was hoping. He didn't know all of them, but he wrote letters to a lot of them, encouraging them to come. And he'd write about these issues they were going to have to deal with. He wrote about the federal government under the Articles of Confederation, making treaties with nations like Holland, the Netherlands, and other foreign countries, and how our various states were violating these treaties. He wrote about states like Virginia and New York. These states were passing laws giving their states' citizens privileges in their ports. You know, when people bring ships into port, they'd put a small tax if you were a citizen from Virginia or a citizen from New York, but they would put other taxes limiting foreign vessels and other boats coming from citizens which belonged to other states coming into their harbors. He wrote a letter to Jefferson in 1786. This is when Jefferson was in France, in which he complained the various states had not paid their share of the bills they'd been sent. You remember, this is one of the problems. He said the states had voted to pay the money, and it was done as part of the idea, how many people in your state, what's your property worth, this is what you owe to support the federal system. He said the states hadn't even sent enough money to pay the interest on their foreign debt to foreign countries where we had borrowed money to help fight the war, let alone run the federal government. They weren't even collecting enough money. That was one of the issues he was dealing with. In another letter to Jefferson, he listed 6 different states that had issued paper money. 6 different states issued their own paper money in 1786. 6 states. And he's going to say, we've got to figure out how to stop this. Can you imagine dealing with something like that? He wrote about the inflation and the damage to commerce that this paper money was doing. Even though they had just dealt with the federal government doing it, the states were doing it. They hadn't learned. And the list goes on. Petty, greedy people. They didn't have a vision of what some of these founding fathers had. They didn't see what was needed. Well, the 1786 convention, 5 people showed up. The Congress set a new date for May 14th, 1787. This was the next year. How many states showed up again on May 14th? How many were there ready to do business? 5. 5 showed up again. So again they couldn't conduct any business. Again they waited. Again they visited. 11 days later, May 25th, 1787, it's a good thing they waited. 7 had finally shown up. 7 were there. 11 days late, but finally they do have 7 states. And so they vote to create a rules committee, which was adopted on May 28th. And then other states gradually started showing up. But this is the type of stuff these men had to deal with when they were trying to give us a constitution, which I believe was inspired by God. But it wasn't easy, and paper money was just one of these issues. You've probably heard the idea you would rather be a foot away from hell, walking away from it, than 1,000 miles away walking toward it. Because if you haven't caught yourself in time, have you saved yourself? You're able to escape a tragedy by walking away from it. If you get within a foot of it and then turn and walk away, you can save yourself. But if you're 1,000 miles away from the disaster and you don't see it, you're going to keep walking towards it, and your fate is certain if you don't wake up. Well, a lot of our founding fathers could see the fate. They could see the problems. They had a vision of it. And they had a problem. How are we going to get this nation to unite? How are we going to get this Constitution? Hey, we've got another caller. Good morning and welcome.
Thank you, Hans. I appreciate your show so much. This is LaDawn.
Hey, well, good morning. This is my sister. This ought to be good.
I just think it's interesting as you talk about the Constitution and some of the challenges that they had in trying to create a document that would give restraint to government, that would enable people to have the ultimate freedom possible, that when I was studying for the gospel doctrine lesson, it talked about in Micah chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, about that out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And there was a comment by President Harold B. Lee, and I just wanted to quote a little bit of that if I could.
Yeah, good. This is great. Thank you.
He said, with the coming of the pioneers to establish the church in the tops of the mountains, our early leaders declared this to be the beginning of the fulfillment of the prophecy that out of Zion should go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And then Elder Lee goes on to say, I have often wondered what that expression meant, that out of Zion should go forth the law. Years ago, I went with the brethren to the Idaho Falls Temple, and I heard in that inspired prayer of the First Presidency a definition of the meaning of that term, out of Zion shall go forth the law. Note what they said in this dedication. We thank thee that thou hast revealed to us that those who gave us our constitutional form of government were wise in thy sight, and that thou didst raise them up for the very purpose of putting forth that sacred document. We pray that kings and rulers and the peoples of all nations under heaven may be persuaded of the blessings enjoyed by the people of this land by reason of their freedom under thy guidance, and be constrained to adopt similar governmental systems, that out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he goes on to say that you will note that it was not merely enough to be good, but all must be willing to bring forth his work and to bring forth and establish Zion and so forth. And I just thought it was interesting that I think a lot of people have read that same scripture both in Isaiah and in Micah, that out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and that this constitutional form of government is meant, and the Lord desires all nations to have a similar type of constitution, because it is divinely inspired, and it is a way for governments to allow their people to have freedom, equal freedom under the law, and it ennobles man, and ennobles man in the idea that he is fit to choose government and to be governed by good government, that man has that capacity to do that. And I just thought that was an interesting, insight from
the
Idaho Falls dedicatory prayer.
Idaho Falls Temple dedicatory prayer, where they talk about the Constitution and the fact that the Lord wants all men to have this. Well, that makes sense, because we know, the LDS know, that our Constitution is the only form of government approved by God.
Yes.
And so it just makes sense that he would want all nations to see the value of it.
Yes. And I was going to comment to also on your first part of the program about laws that we sometimes enact, even our representatives, and that I think it's true that many people just simply have not been educated about correct principles regarding government.
Mm-hmm.
And that is probably what you're doing is so important to help us to understand the principles upon which good government is based and upon which we should vote for particular laws.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I appreciate your observation. I mean well. I guess that's another way to say it.
Yes, I think that's so important, and not that we don't condemn people because they don't necessarily sometimes do things the way we would do them, but recognizing that many times we have been so steeped in secular and humanistic philosophy that that does not enable man to trust man.
Yeah.
That we believe that people are not capable of being trusted with power and or taking care of their neighbors or so forth. That all of us are in kind of a world where we need to watch out for ourselves, and we assume that everyone else will be the same. So I think understanding the correct principles is the most important thing we can do in changing our ideas about good government. So anyway,
I appreciate your thoughts. That's great. And
all
thank
right.
you.
Go forward.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, going back to my notes here, we've just I appreciate that call. That's good. We were talking about this paper money issue and about all these states that were involved in paper money and what a challenge that was going to be to Madison and these other founding fathers that wanted to undo that evil. Here's another evil. You hear about people talking about the Constitution and religious freedom, and there'll be no religious test, and the government will not be involved in setting up a religion. Why would they put that in the Constitution? Here's some other stuff I got out of these letters of Madison. Let me ask you this. How many states were involved in supporting churches with tax dollars in 1776? I'd never thought about this before. Do you know how many states had state-sponsored churches in 1776? 9. 9 of the 13 colonies had taxes. They collected taxes from people to support their churches. Some of them it was based, well, what's the most membership in this county for this church or that church? That's the one we're going to support with taxes. Others it was more general. But can you imagine that? Here these people did not think that was right. 9 of 13 in 1776 had church-supported or state-supported churches. Suppose the major religion in our state, I'm a member of that major one, had passed a law compelling we citizens pay 1% or 5% or 10% of our income to our church leaders today. How would you feel about it? Suppose you were a non-member. I've got a good friend who's a Buddhist. How do you think he would feel if I sent the sheriff to collect 10% of his income from my church? Suppose I said he ought to pay tithing. He not only ought to, I'm going to make him do it. I'm going to pass some laws. Well, 9 of 13 colonies had that. You know, if you were someone who believed a man's religious faith was between him and his God and not something he was supposed to be forced to participate in, and they got this from Europe. That's what was going on in Europe. We talked about people coming here for religious freedom. Some did. Others came here. They were strong religion-minded people, but they thought, well, we'll just do it the way we did it back home. We're going to use force. But you and I, we might get upset if a local church leader was to say, I want you to vote, and I want you to vote to force everyone to pay me to preach. I'll do good things with that money. I want you to vote to force people to participate in supporting me. And when you realize many people came to America, they still had ancestors with this experience still fresh in their minds of church leaders who not only forced citizens to support them with tax dollars, but they'd jail or torture or martyr other Christians who are not of the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church or some other church, which were break-offs from some of these churches. You know, in the minds of many, breaking away from a king, imposing his will by force, went hand in hand with breaking away from a church, which also was accustomed to imposing its will by force of government, by law also. You here in America, or yet here in America, we still use force on non-believers. We did back then. Many of the states did. Who knows how many states were still taxing citizens to support churches in 1787 when the Constitution was adopted? Do you know how many were still doing it? 7. 7 were still supporting churches with tax money. And our founding fathers that were there decided we're not going to do that anymore. But their new law did not apply to the states. It only applied to the federal system. So anyway, that's some of the history of the founding fathers, some of the stuff that they were dealing with, some of the stuff they said, we got to stop this. There's others. But we've run out of time to discuss others. We'll get involved in some of this other stuff next week. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to live in a free country where I can get on the radio and I can say, this is what I think. I appreciate you callers calling in and saying, well, this is what I think. I hope you'll participate next week. Give us a call here as we continue this discussion of our founding fathers, the greatness of our Constitution, the greatness of God in giving us these freedoms, giving us this country, giving this land, and see what they rose out of. Thank you. This is Hans Anderson. We'll see you next week. And have a good day.
Things were gone. I'd worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife. Thank my lucky stars to be living here today, 'cause the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston and New York to LA. There's pride in every American heart, and it's time we stand and say that I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. And I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free. And I won't forget the men who died, who gave that right to me. And I gladly stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA.
preceding was a paid commercial program. Opinions expressed are the sole responsibility of the party expressing them.
1400 K-Star is KSRR Provo.